All right, eighth grade, our last day of notes here. We are going to be going through and getting down our notes about Reconstruction. I think John Green's video yesterday did a pretty nice job of summarizing some of the main points. And so this will be your chance to write down those notes. There is a good amount of notes, but of course, what more appropriate way for us to end our time together than by taking a bunch of notes? So here is everything want you to know about Reconstruction in 15 minutes. Here we go. All right. So Reconstruction again is just the period of rebuilding and reuniting the U.S. after the Civil War. Um, since the Southern states had left the Union, they seceded. They now had to be readmitted to the Union, but there was debates about how this should happen fairly, right? How much do we punish the South for what they did? Do we punish them to the extent where maybe they become bitter and want to leave again? Do we the other fear is that if you don't punish them enough, then the same Confederate type leaders will come back into power, and there will be discrimination and attempts to reestablish slavery. So, Lincoln was more moderate in this case. He believed that really the way to bring the South back into the Union would be by treating them fairly and showing them some grace. And so his 10% plan said that 10% of the state's voter population would have to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. Once they did that, they could form a new state government, adopt a new state constitution that, of course, banned slavery, and then they would be readmitted. He also wanted to extend amnesty, which is a legal pardon, to any Southerner who swore loyalty to the Union. Radical Republicans thought that this was a little too lenient, and they passed the Wade-Davis bill in 1864. And this basically said that more than 50% of the state's white male population had to swear loyalty to the Union. No Confederate soldier or officer would be able to vote, and no Confederate soldier or officer would be able to hold an elected position. Lincoln did end up vetoing this bill, but it did make him realize that he would have to compromise with the radical Republicans and perhaps create a Reconstruction plan that did treat the Confederates a little bit more harshly. So go ahead and get these notes down. What it says behind me is after the Civil War. All right. So, as we know, on April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor and a Confederate sympathizer. With his death, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumes the presidency, and his plan is known as Restoration. He wants to grant amnesty to Confederates once they swore loyalty to the Union. High-ranking Confederates could only gain amnesty by appealing to Johnson directly. And this was really an attempt to embarrass those high-ranking Confederates. Johnson was a Southerner, but he was a Republican, which was kind of almost an oxymoron during the war. He really felt like Southern leaders kind of tricked Southern citizens into secession, and he wanted to kind of humiliate them for doing that. And only white Southerners who had been pardoned could vote. So essentially, only people who had swore loyalty to the Union could vote. But it was only white Southerners. He opposed equal rights for African Americans, and he was quoted as saying, "White men alone must manage the South." White men had been managing the South since the beginning of U.S. history, and we see that that did not work out very well for African Americans. And of course, things coming full circle, white men again ruling the South would continue to not work well for African Americans. So get these notes down. Let's look at how that plan shook out. Okay. So there was a lot of rioting and violence that was taking place towards African Americans in southern cities. Obviously, a lot of former Confederates basically blamed African Americans for the war, right? That slavery was what the war was about, and now because they wanted their freedom so bad. That's what caused the Civil War, and they were essentially the blame for everything bad happening in the South. So this convinced radical Republicans that Johnson's plan was not strong enough. They were going to have to be more controlling of Southern states to ensure the safety of the newly freed African Americans. Southern states were passing what was known as black codes, which were laws to control free men and women. These should seem very familiar to slave codes, which were laws to control slaves. No real difference here, right? They are laws to control African Americans. So Congress in 1866 passed the first Civil Rights Act, which granted full citizenship to African Americans and gave the federal government the power to intervene in states' affairs to protect their rights, essentially nullifying black codes and giving the federal government the authority to step in during these types of riots and violence towards African Americans. This also contradicted the Dred Scott decision that declared that African Americans were not citizens. Remember, the Dred Scott case was Dred Scott, the slave who was taken into free territory, and he believed that he should be free, but the Supreme Court ruled he was property, so he couldn't even sue his owner in the first place. So this contradicted that decision and would lead to that decision being overturned by the Supreme Court. Congress feared that the act would be overturned, so they decided to make it a little bit more permanent by passing the 14th Amendment, which granted full citizenship to all people born in the United States and added more protections for citizens. Strangely enough, the only people not included as citizens here would be Native Americans who were born in the United States. Because there was still a lot of conflicts happening with Native Americans. All right, so go ahead and I'll move my face here so you can pause and get down the top half. And then I'll move my face here so you can get down the bottom half. All right. Next slide. All right, so of the 11 southern states, only Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment. And so, again, this signaled to Republicans in Congress that the southern states were not ready to be full members of the Union. So the first Reconstruction Act called for the creation of new governments in these 10 other southern states that had not ratified the 14th Amendment. And as they were establishing these new governments in these southern states, many white Southerners refused to vote in those elections. But the thousands of newly registered African Americans did vote in those elections. So Republicans gained control of southern state governments, Republicans who are going to give more rights and more protection to African Americans. So in the eyes of Republicans in Congress, this is definitely a step in the right direction. But unfortunately, this isn't going to last very long. So go ahead and get these notes down for me. Again, the radical Republicans and President Johnson were pretty at odds about everything that should be done during Reconstruction. And so the video that I've linked here kind of summarizes in more detail what happened. But basically what happened is that Johnson opposed the radical Reconstruction. He removed Secretary of War Edward Stanton, who was a radical Republican, without the Senate's approval. This is a direct violation of the law they just passed called the the Tenure of Office Act. And he was impeached by the Senate. He was impeached by the House, but the Senate failed to reach the 2/3 majority necessary to remove him from office. So essentially he was impeached because he broke this law, but really because radical Republicans were very unhappy with him. And Republicans in the Senate thought that he shouldn't be impeached just because of political differences, which is a similar argument to what we just heard in the most recent impeachment proceedings. All right, let's go ahead to the next one. So we have the election of 1868. Ulysses S. Grant wins the election. This really showed that a majority of voters supported the Republican approach to Reconstruction. And you see he carried Southern states, and that is, of course, in large part to former Confederates not being allowed to vote, and African Americans being allowed to vote. In 1969, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, which prohibited state and federal governments from denying the right to vote to any male citizen because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, with that, they say, all done. We've guaranteed African Americans voting rights, and that will be good. We're good to go now. But Southern Democrats and former Confederates, still very bitter about all this, are scheming for ways to continue to make African Americans disenfranchised, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So go ahead and pause, get this down. Okay, so there was like some corruption scandals that happened in Grant's administration. He was not really involved with them, but he wasn't. He was a general. He was a military leader. He wasn't a great politician, and so he did not surround himself with the best people to be surrounded by. This caused a split in the Republican Party, and liberal Republicans favored a more peaceful reconciliation with Southern whites. So they passed the Amnesty Act, which pardoned most former Confederates. So now, almost all Southern whites, most of whom are former Confederates, can vote and hold office again. And so the balance of power has now shifted back away from the African Americans towards the Southern Democrats. The Democrats that are elected are called redeemers because they have redeemed or saved the South from Republican rule, which shows you what they thought about all of these rights and safeties being given to Southern African Americans. So their conservative policies are going to dominate Southern politics well into the 1900s. And that's in large part because of what they do once they become elected, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So what you need to know here is essentially that Democrats are now back in power in the South. And so we'll see what they do with that power on the next slide. Let's go. So the Redeemer policies basically were to implement voting restrictions that limited African Americans' right to vote without explicitly making it about race. Because remember, we just passed an amendment that said you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race. But it didn't say anything about the right to vote based on your economic ability or your education level. And so they implemented poll taxes, which were you had to pay to vote. Most Southern African Americans were just slaves, right? They didn't have money, so they couldn't vote. They passed literacy tests. You had to prove that you could read and write to be able to vote. Again, they just left slavery. They were not given an education, so most of them could not read or write, so they couldn't vote. And then the grandfather clause, which said that if your grandfather was a slave, that you couldn't vote. So it's not your previous condition of servitude, but your ancestors' previous condition of servitude. And so this kept, obviously, many African Americans from being able to vote and further tightened the Democratic control of these Southern state governments. From there, they start implementing Jim Crow laws, which is legalized discrimination, and segregation, which is to separate the races to Black facilities and white facilities. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a famous writer and civil rights activist, really, I think, said it best. He said, "The slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." There was a period of Reconstruction where it seemed like maybe the South would be making change in a positive, more inclusive direction. But of course, many Southerners resisted that, and they ended up being able to impose racially biased policies that would set the South back until the 50s and 60s. I have very little time left, so I just want to show you this slide. These are all resources to find out more about Reconstruction. The Khan Academy course is really good. I highly suggest it. There's some other media that's kind of around the same topic. Thank you guys for bearing with me. I only have a few seconds left, but I love you all. Thank you for all your hard work. And I'll be talking and seeing to you guys all soon, I'm sure. Thanks.